The trunk strap cut deeper each time Patricia shifted her grip, and by the time she reached the archway of the posting yard, her right palm had opened in a thin, bright line that rain kept washing clean. Dawn had not yet broken. The sky was slate, the cobbles black with water, the lamps guttering in iron cages that hissed when the wind turned. She kept walking because there was nowhere to stop without being pushed aside. Carters cursed at one another near stacked barrels. A woman with 2 geese in a wicker crate stared openly at Patricia's dress, at the soaked hem dragging mud, then looked away with the small contempt reserved for servants who had delayed someone richer. Patricia lowered her eyes and bent her shoulders under the trunk as though it weighed less than it did. Her breath came in shallow pools. Wet wool clung to her spine. Her shoes gave a sucking sound at every step where both soles had split. The gatekeeper did not ask her name. He looked once at the chipped brass tag tied to the trunk handle, red veil in crooked black letters, and jerked his chin toward the far end of the yard, where dogs were tethered beneath a leaking shed roof. "Stand there until called," he said. "Do not block the lane." She curtsied from habit, though he had already turned. She dragged the trunk to the place he had indicated and set it down beside crates marked with shipping marks from York and Leeds. One hound raised its head and sniffed her sleeve. Another whined and settled again in straw gone dark with rain. She stayed standing because Lady Vale had said she would stand. She had been ordered not to sit where passengers might see. She had been ordered not to speak unless addressed. She had been ordered not to present herself as family, even in the privacy of an inn-yard where no one would believe her if she did. The cold reached her first through her fingers, then through her ankles where water crept past cracked leather and threadbare stockings, then through the seams of her stays, mended with twine where whalebone had snapped last spring. The twine scratched when she breathed too deeply. Her stomach had been empty since noon the day before, after a heel of bread and weak tea in the servants' passage, and hunger had moved past complaint into a hollow heat that made the smell of horse mash and frying fat from the kitchen door almost unbearable. A coachman dropped from a box seat and tore into a meat pie under the eaves, steam rising as he broke it open. She turned her face away so quickly she made herself dizzy. The rain struck the side of her neck and ran beneath her collar. She swallowed once, then again. Saliva did not come. Lady Vale's footman arrived 10 minutes later with 2 hat boxes under oilcloth and a travelling casket balanced against his hip, as though he carried silver to a ball rather than garments to the north. His coat was dry. His boots were polished. He crossed the yard in a neat line from carriage to covered porch, without glancing at Patricia until the second trip, when he stopped just beyond her shoulder and spoke to the air in front of her. "Her ladyship asks whether you still possess the packet." Patricia lifted her left hand. The packet was tucked inside her sleeve under tied ribbon, wrapped in waxed linen. "Yes," she said. "Do not say yes." He still did not look at her. "Say, yes, sir. You forget yourself daily." She corrected herself. "Yes, sir." He sniffed and adjusted the hat boxes. "If the seal is broken when you arrive at Haldon House, do not return. There will be no place for you." Then he walked away, stepping around a puddle so that water would not touch his cuff. A pair of gentlemen in greatcoats crossed the yard speaking of roads and rents. One of them brushed Patricia's shoulder hard enough to rock her against the trunk. "Mind where you place your goods," he said without turning. She murmured apology, though she had not moved. Goods, not girl, not woman. The words settled in her chest with the rest. She felt the familiar narrowing happen inside her. The narrowing kept her safe. It reduced each moment to tasks. Hold the packet dry. Keep the trunk near. Do not fall. Do not answer insults. Do not lift your eyes to faces that are praise. She had learned that looking directly invited conversation, and conversation invited pity or worse. Pity was brief. Worse lasted. A drover laughed as one of the dogs shook water over her skirt. "That one matches the baggage," he said to no one who cared. Patricia bent and wiped mud from the trunk's latch with her sleeve because hands occupied in labour were less likely to tremble. Her fingers were fine-boned and narrow, shaped for penwork her father had once praised in a study lined floor to ceiling with maps and books. Ink had stained the sides of those fingers so often that faint blue shadows still marked the skin near her nails despite the lye soap in Lady Vale's laundry room. They looked strange now against the rough wood and iron bands of travel freight. Scholars' hands turned porters' hands. She flexed them once to drive sensation back and felt the cut in her palm sting with rainwater and grit. Around her, wheels ground over stone. Harness chains clinked. A stable boy slipped, cursed, and went on carrying oats with his cap pulled low. No one paused. No one asked whether she had shelter. To the yard she was a piece of transit property waiting a direction. She had been property in subtler ways for 3 years. First, while her father lay fevered and still insisted she read to him from Livy in the evenings, because his mind remained clear though his hands shook. Then, after the funeral, when ledgers appeared in Lady Vale's hand with columns Patricia had never seen, and promissory notes bearing signatures that leaned too heavily on downstrokes where her father's script had always lifted clean. "Debts," Lady Vale said, "old obligations, regrettable but unavoidable." The library was sold by inventory before the mourning cloth had been folded. Carters carried away dictionaries, folios, dispatch books, the globe with the crack along the Black Sea. Loyal servants were dismissed in batches, each with a story about economy and necessity. Patricia's room on the second floor was given to a visitor, and she was moved to the attic with a cot beneath a draughty dormer. In drawing rooms, with lavender at her wrists and lace at her throat, Lady Vale called her the Russian burden, as though blood itself were a miscalculation. Rain thickened to a harder slant. Patricia pulled her shawl tighter, though wool turned heavy when soaked, and gave little comfort. She shifted from one foot to the other to keep feeling in her toes. Beneath the shawl, against her stays, she carried the one item Lady Vale had not found, because Lady Vale did not search stitching done by hands. She considered useless. A narrow notebook, brown linen cover, pages sewn in 3 signatures, small enough to disappear under bodice seams. Patricia had copied into it legal terms from old leasehold agreements, estate account forms, definitions of entailment and guardianship, figures from rents and tithes she had seen before they were altered for presentation. Candlelight had burned her eyes raw on those nights. Wax had dripped onto her thumb and hardened there. She had kept copying. Numbers did not flatter rank. Figures either balanced or betrayed their keeper. A woman selling hot broth from a kettle paused under the eaves and called to the yard in a hoarse voice. 2 pennies a cup. Patricia had 1 farthing in her pocket and could not spend it because Lady Vale had ordered her to account for all coin upon arrival. She watched steam rise in pale ropes and looked away before the seller could catch her gaze. Hunger made strange arithmetic of the body. The mind remained clear enough to pass orders and times, but the limbs grew distant. Her knees ached. Her lower back throbbed from the trunk. Her jaw tightened each time someone passed close. A drayman lit a cheroot, and the sulphur flare painted faces in quick orange relief, then left them grey again. One child in a nursemaid's arms pointed at Patricia and asked if she slept in the yard. The nursemaid hushed him, then glanced over with embarrassed interest, as though wondering the same. By first light the rain had washed channels through the midden near the stable wall. Straw floated in little rivers between cobbles. Patricia's skirt was soaked to mid-thigh. She no longer felt the line of wet. She felt only weight. The cut in her palm had stopped bleeding and gone numb. She tested her grip on the trunk handle, still strong enough. Her breath fogged pale in front of her mouth. Across the yard, Lady Vale's carriage remained under canvas, wheels chocked, while a groom polished mud from the crest as if the family honour might be preserved in lacquer, even while one of its daughters stood among dogs and freight. Patricia looked at the painted device only once. A falcon over crossed keys. Her father had explained heraldry to her when she was 9, laughing as he pretended solemnity. Symbols matter because men make them matter, he had said, then kissed her inked knuckles and told her to study contracts more than crests. "Petrov!" The voice came from behind, clipped, impatient. She turned. The yard clerk stood with a slate in one hand and rain dripping from his hat brim. His eyes flicked over her and paused on the trunk tag. "You are for the North Relay. Change at St. Albans, then York Line if roads hold." He scratched marks on his slate. "You will ride outside unless there is vacancy. No complaints accepted." Patricia inclined her head. "Yes, sir." He narrowed his gaze at her dress, at the patched seams and torn cuff where thread had frayed to fringe. "You are a governess, are you?" The word was not a question. It was disbelief shaped like one. She felt heat rise under cold skin. "I am engaged to a household in that capacity," she said carefully. He gave a short grunt that might have been laughter and called for a porter. The porter did not come. Patricia lifted the trunk herself. Pain ran from her palm up her forearm and settled at the elbow like iron. She walked toward the waiting coach as the first clean stripe of morning opened behind chimney pots beyond the yard wall. Passengers already seated looked past her as though she were part of the luggage train. A lady in sable gloves drew her skirt away from the step when Patricia approached. The guard took the trunk, weighed it with a glance, and lashed it among boxes and baskets without speaking. Patricia climbed to the outside bench, hands stiff on wet wood, shoulders bowed against the wind. Beneath her bodice, the hidden notebook pressed warm against her ribs. In her sleeve, the sealed packet waited for Halden House. The coach jolted once, then rolled forward through the gate, and London began to slide behind her in grey rain. The coach lurched through the gate and hit the first rut hard enough to jar Patricia's teeth together, and she tightened both hands on the slick edge of the outside bench until the cut in her palm burned again. Rain struck her face in cold needles. Wind drove under her shawl and found every seam the wet had already weakened. Behind her, London chimneys blurred into a dark smear. Ahead, lamps thinned, then vanished. The guard shouted to the team and the wheels found a steadier line, and in that rough rhythm her mind did what it always did when there was no room to move and no one to answer. It went back to the last place she had belonged. Her father's study had smelled of lamp oil, paper dust, and old wool warmed by a coal grate that never quite heated the corners. Shelves rose to the ceiling. Maps curled at the edges. He had set her at the wide table with a ruler and a bottle of black ink, and told her that language was a tool sharper than any blade in a house like theirs. "Read the small hand, Pasha," he had said, tapping the margin where clauses nested like traps. "Men will show you a crest and conceal a condition. Trust the condition." He had called her Pasha only there, never in company, and the sound of it now rose so clearly above the rattle of wheels that she had to swallow against the pressure at her throat. He had been alive then, broad in shoulder despite the cough that came each winter, patient even when his joints ached and the pen slipped in his fingers. Her mother had already been gone 6 years, taken by a fever that emptied rooms for months afterward, and grief had made him quiet, but not cruel. He had read dispatches by candlelight and let Patricia sit beside him with a grammar open on her knees. On evenings when rain struck the windows exactly as it struck her now, he had asked for Livy in Latin and corrected her gently when she rushed. Then the final fever came in July, wrong for the season and relentless. He had still asked for translation sheets. He had still insisted on balance columns for rents due at Michaelmas. He had still tried to stand when creditors came to the door, though his hands shook so hard he could not knot his cravat. 3 days before he died, he had pressed his signet into warm wax, sealed a packet she never saw again, and told her in a voice worn thin by heat, "Keep copies. Originals can be stolen." She had nodded because she could not trust herself to speak. At the graveside, Lady Vale had stood in widow's black with dry eyes and a handkerchief scented with lavender, and by supper she had asked for keys. By the time the coach reached the turnpike north of the city, Patricia could no longer feel her left foot. Yet the numbness did not dull the old sequence. It sharpened it. Her father had remarried Lady Vale when Patricia was 17, after 2 winters of pressure from neighbours who said a scholar could not run a household without a wife, and from men of business who preferred to bargain with a hostess in silk rather than a daughter with ink on her cuff. Lady Vale had arrived with trunks, 2 daughters, and a smile that never touched her eyes. Arabella was all blonde gloss and careful laughter. Cressida had dimples and a talent for repeating the last cruel phrase in a room as if she had invented it. During the courtship they had called her Patricia Sister in public and borrowed ribbons in private. After the wedding breakfast they took inventory. The nursery silver went first to their room. Patricia's mother's shawl vanished from the cedar chest. A miniature portrait from her dressing table appeared a week later on Arabella's mantel with no explanation offered and none permitted. When Patricia asked for it back, Lady Vale had looked up from her embroidery and said, "You mistake possession for entitlement, my dear. You possess very little." The daughters learned her methods quickly. They praised Patricia's useful plainness when guests were present and sent her to fetch warmed bricks for their beds when doors were closed. They wore her late mother's pearl pins to musicales and told acquaintances they had always been theirs. They asked for French phrases and repeated them badly before laughing that Russian blood made pronunciation thick. At table, if Patricia reached for bread before Lady Vale nodded, Cressida would tap the knife against porcelain and murmur, "The burden forgets." Twice, when Patricia answered too directly, Lady Vale corrected her with fingertips at the inside of her wrist where sleeves hid marks. Once in the blue drawing-room, before 3 callers and a curate's wife, Lady Vale said, "Miss Petrov has a mind for sums and very little else, which is fortunate, as sums are all she will ever need." The women had smiled. Patricia had poured tea without spilling, though heat had surged up her neck so hard she thought she might faint. She did not faint. She learned which servants could be trusted with silence. She learned that Mrs. Davies in the laundry would leave mending where Patricia could find it, and that old Harris, before he was dismissed, would pause by the study door just long enough for her to copy 1 more line from the rent book before it was removed to Lady Vale's desk. She learned that humiliation, endured without witness, became skill. At Finchley, the coach changed horses under a low sky that had turned from iron to colourless white, and the pause gave her 10 minutes on aching legs while passengers inside drank hot coffee from thick cups and complained of mud. Patricia stood by the wheel with rain dripping from her hem and watched the ostler tighten harness straps, and memory moved with the same practical precision. Lady Vale had not announced ruin in 1 dramatic hour. She had built it by increments and paper. First came the call for economies, then the dismissal of the undercook, then 2 maids, then Harris with his rheumatism and 40 years of service. "Unavoidable," Lady Vale said, smoothing bills that bore unfamiliar seals. "Your father was generous to a fault." Patricia had asked to review the accounts. Lady Vale had laughed, a soft breath through her nose. "Children do not audit their guardians." Patricia was 20 then, legally no child, but law in a drawing-room bent toward the hand that controlled invitations and coin. Crates arrived with appraisers. The library was catalogued in 2 days. Volumes with her father's notes in the margins were sold by lot to men who spoke loudly over one another, as if memory itself were merchandise. She stood in the doorway and watched a clerk tie twine around a stack of dispatch histories while Lady Vale discussed card tables for the winter season. The globe with the crack along the Black Sea rolled out under a porter's arm. Patricia felt the loss physically, as if ribs had been loosened and one removed. After the sale, Lady Vale presented ledgers at supper and tapped a column of debts with a jewelled nail. "There is no dowry to discuss," she said. "There are obligations to settle." Patricia looked at the figures and saw at once what did not belong. Duplicate signatures where her father had signed once, altered numerals pressed darker than the line around them, dates transposed to create arrears that had never existed. She said so. Lady Vale set down her fork and regarded her as if at a stranger who had overstepped in a hired gown. "You will not accuse me in my own house," Patricia answered. "It is my father's house." Lady Vale rose and crossed the distance with silk whispering over carpet, and the slap was sharp enough to turn Patricia's face toward the window where rain traced the glass. No one spoke. Arabella reached for pudding. Cressida lowered her eyes and smiled. That night Patricia moved to the attic under the pretext of chimney repairs. Her second-floor room was given to a guest who stayed 3 nights and left rose petals ground into the rug. Bread portions grew smaller. Candles were counted. The key to the old dispatch cabinet disappeared. Patricia began copying everything she could reach into a stitched notebook by the light of a wick trimmed to a pin, writing until wax hardened on her knuckles and dawn showed through warped boards. When the fresh team pulled them onward, one inside passenger leaned from the coach door and tossed a parcel to the guard with a complaint that the outside girl was dripping on the step, and Patricia drew farther back on the bench to make herself narrower than she already was. The road opened north in long, wet stretches, bordered by bare hedges and fields sunk to mud, and each mile seemed to carry the weight of the house she had left rather than release it. Lady Vale had found other uses for her before sending her away. She became unpaid companion when callers of rank required one more woman in a carriage. She became seamstress when hems split. She became copyist when invitations had to be answered in a hand finer than Lady Vale's own. At balls, she stood near the wall in altered gowns and watched Arabella and Cressida take introductions that had once been quietly promised to her as her father's daughter. Men asked Lady Vale whether Miss Petroff was a cousin from abroad or a governess between posts. Lady Vale always gave the same answer with a small, regretful sigh. "A dependent. We do what we can." The phrase spread through London rooms faster than scandal. Dependents were useful if silent, inconvenient if visible, and disposable when debts sharpened. Patricia understood the arithmetic before the packet was placed in her sleeve. 3 nights earlier, in Lady Vale's private sitting room, scented with rosewater and spilled cordial, she had been told to travel north at once to Halden House under papers naming her as a seasoned governess. "You will present these credentials unopened," Lady Vale said, tapping the waxed packet Patricia now carried against her skin. "You will obey their steward. You will not discuss family affairs. In exchange, your board and position will be secured." Patricia had asked, "For what term?" Lady Vale's mouth had curved. "For as long as you are wanted." The answer had settled like ice. She knew then this was no placement arranged for her future. It was a transfer to satisfy someone else's account. Yet she had curtsied and said, "Yes, my lady," because refusal without resources was theatre, not resistance. Real resistance required record, witness, and time. The notebook pressed against her ribs now with each jolt of the coach, a narrow warmth in cold wool, proof that she had not surrendered the one discipline her father had left her. Rain thinned at last to mist. Her hands trembled from cold and fatigue, but her mind remained exact. Debts had figures, signatures had forms, lies left edges if one looked long enough. She looked until her eyes burned and kept looking as the road carried her towards the house where those edges might finally be seen. She looked until her eyes burned and kept looking as the road carried her toward the house where those edges might finally be seen. And then the axle screamed, the coach shuddered, and every passenger lurched as the driver hauled the team down before a posting inn crouched beside the road like a wet animal in the dark. The sign over the yard gate swung on one chain and struck the post in the wind. Lantern light ran in crooked lines across puddles. Steam rose from horse flanks. Patricia climbed down from the outside bench on legs that had gone stiff as wood, and when her boots met the ground, the shock ran through her knees so sharply she had to catch the wheel with one hand. The guard untied luggage and shouted names. No one shouted hers. She waited until the last trunk dropped, then reached for hers, swallowed the pain in her palm, and dragged it beneath the eaves where water came in a slant instead of a sheet. Inside, the common room was packed with smoke and damp wool, and the noise of men arguing over road conditions. She did not belong there. The look from the innkeeper's wife made that plain before Patricia crossed the threshold. A servant's glance, quick and assessing, landed on Patricia's hem, on her patched cuff, on the travel tag marked Vale, and then moved away to customers who paid in silver. Patricia did not ask for a seat. She did not ask for broth. She carried the trunk along the wall and found the narrow passage to the rear where kitchen heat leaked through warped boards. The scullery was colder than the hall, but empty for 1 minute, perhaps 2. Copper pans hung black with use. A bucket stood under a drip from the ceiling. She set the trunk against the wall, flexed her fingers once, and pulled from her pocket the crust she had saved since Finchley. It was hard enough to scrape her tongue. She bit down anyway. Hunger made no distinction between stale and fresh. She had swallowed 2 mouthfuls when the back door slammed so hard the latch struck plaster, and a stable boy crashed in, mud to his knees, cap gone, eyes wide white in a face streaked with rain. "Coach over on the East Road," he shouted to no one and everyone. "Wheel split at the ditch. 1 gentleman thrown. 1 young lord struck senseless. Send linen, send brandy. His Grace is here." The crust turned to paste in her throat. She coughed once and forced air back in. In the kitchen beyond, someone dropped a tray. A maid cried out. Boots pounded the flagstones. The innkeeper's wife pushed through the doorway, apron twisted in her fist. "Who has clean cloth? Where is Mr. Bell? Move, all of you, move!" She saw Patricia, saw only an extra pair of hands, and snapped, "You! Boil water!" Patricia was already at the hearth. She fed wood under the black kettle and set it to heat. Voices piled over one another in the passage. "He is not breathing right. Do not move him. Fetch the surgeon. There is no surgeon within 5 miles." Then another voice, lower, controlled, cutting through the rest like a knife laid flat on wood. "Inside, now!" The command carried from the yard. No raised volume, no uncertainty. The room obeyed before its owner appeared. Men came through the door bearing a long shape on a shutter pulled from hinges, boots sliding on wet stone. Water dripped from coats and pooled under the makeshift litter. Patricia stepped back to clear space and saw a face in lantern light, young and pale, dark hair plastered to his temple with rain. A child on the cusp of adolescence, perhaps 12 or 13, jaw still fine, throat bruised where a neckcloth had tightened in the fall. His lashes were still against his skin. There was blood at his hairline and more across his collar where cloth had soaked through. A groom pressed a wad of linen there with shaking hands. "Do not press there," Patricia said, before she chose to speak. "You are choking him." The groom glared. "Who are you to—" "Do not press there," she repeated sharper now, and moved him aside with the authority of necessity more than rank. She slid fingers under the young lord's jaw, lifted, found breath, thin but present. She turned his head to free the airway and felt warm blood slick under her hand from a scalp cut that looked worse than its depth. She had seen such wounds when stable hands struck beams in low lofts. Frightening, not always fatal. She asked for bandage strips. No one moved. She tore the bottom from her own petticoat with both hands and folded it tight. "Hold this lamp higher," she said. A maid obeyed, trembling. By the second week of October the rain had begun to smell of iron before dawn, and tonight that same iron smell filled the scullery as Patricia pressed cloth to the wound and counted the young man's breaths under her own. Bootsteps entered behind her, slow and heavy. The noise in the room thinned without instruction. She felt more than saw the shift in every body as men who had been shouting fell silent and straightened. Patricia looked up. He stood in the doorway with rain running from the edge of his greatcoat to the stone, tall enough that the lintel seemed too low, broad shoulders squared against the cold, dark hair wet and pushed back from a face carved to severity, a scar pale along one cheek where old damage had healed without softness. His eyes were not grey as rumour gave all dukes by default. They were darker, a storm sea colour that watched and assessed and withheld. His gloves were gone. One hand was reddened at the knuckles, as if he had struck wood or stone and not noticed. A groom behind him whispered, "Your Grace," though no one needed reminding. The Duke of Holden did not look at anyone else first. He looked at her. His gaze dropped to her torn sleeve, to the blood on her fingers, to the cloth pressed at his son's head, to the old yellowing marks at her wrist where Lady Vale's corrections had lived under cuffs. When he spoke, his voice was level and cold enough to make every spoon and pan in the room seem louder by contrast. "You are not what I ordered." Patricia rose to her knees from the crouch beside the litter and gave him a curtsy anyway, one hand still red, one hand braced at the young lord's shoulder to keep him from rolling. Rainwater slid from her hair onto her cheek. She did not wipe it. "No, Your Grace," she said, "but he will die if your steward waits for permission." For one breath nothing moved. Then Holden crossed the room in 3 strides. Men gave way before him without being asked. He knelt opposite her, greatcoat spreading over dirty stone, and put 2 fingers at his son's throat. He counted. His jaw tightened. He looked at the cloth in her hand, at the angle of the neck she had set, at the improvised bandage strip. "What is your name?" "Patricia Petrov. The governess." The word carried no belief. She met his gaze once, and lowered it. "That is what the papers say." His eyes flicked to the innkeeper's wife. "Where is the nearest surgeon?" "Harborough village, Your Grace. 6 miles, perhaps 7 in this weather." Holden stood without haste. "Send 2 riders. Wake him. Bring him whether he wishes to come or not." He looked to a footman at the door. Hot bricks, blankets, brandy, now. The footman ran. Halden turned back to Patricia. Can he be moved? Not flat and not fast, she said. His head must stay supported. If he vomits, he must be turned. If you jolt him, he may stop breathing. You give orders easily. I give them only when no one else will. A muscle moved once in his cheek. Not approval, not anger surrendered. A recognition filed away for later. His son made a low sound then, a broken breath that turned to a cough. Patricia shifted immediately, rolled him as far as she could without losing support, cleared his mouth with cloth, and held him through the spasm until air came clean again. When she looked up, Halden had not moved. He was watching her hands with military attention, as if memorizing each step. Stephen, he said, voice low now near his son's ear, open your eyes. No response. Halden did not repeat himself. He rose and gave 2 clipped instructions to men at the door, then faced Patricia again. Come to Halden House with us. You will continue this care until the surgeon arrives. She froze. The sealed packet in her sleeve felt suddenly heavy as iron. My instructions are to report first to your steward with credentials. You are speaking to your steward's master. Yes, Your Grace. Then obey. There was no room in that word for negotiation. There was also beneath it the shape of protection she had not expected. Not kindness. Something harder. A line drawn. She nodded once. He needs heat at his feet and neck, not on the wound. And no more than 1 spoon of brandy unless he wakes enough to swallow safely. Halden called to a servant without turning away from her. You heard Miss Petrov. Miss, not girl, not baggage. The title struck with almost physical force. They moved the young lord on a door padded with folded cloaks. Patricia walked beside the litter through the yard, one hand steady at the bandage, while rain hammered roofs and horses stamped clouds of steam into the dark. Halden walked on the other side, bareheaded now, his shoulder nearly level with hers, his silence dense as stone. At the carriage he ordered cushions lashed to the floor and made space by sending 2 men to ride behind. He took his son's weight first, lifted with care that revealed long practice at command and none at helplessness, then looked at Patricia. Inside. She hesitated a fraction. Wet dress, servant's shoes, blood on her cuff. She had never ridden in a duke's private carriage. Halden's eyes hardened. Inside, Miss Petrov. She climbed in and took her place on the floor cushions beside Stephen's head. Halden entered opposite and braced 1 boot against the frame as the coach lurched forward. Lantern light swung across his face with each rut, carving shadow under his cheekbones, catching rain still on his lashes. He did not ask whether she was cold. He took off his greatcoat and dropped it across Stephen's legs, without looking away from his son. The road to Halden House was a sequence of jolts and held breaths. Twice Stephen stirred and fought the pressure at his head. Twice Patricia soothed him with short commands learned from fever wards and attics and long nights with no physician. Still now. Breathe through it. Do not turn. Each time Halden watched and said nothing. At one deep rut, the carriage pitched hard and Patricia's shoulder struck his knee. Heat flashed through her where wool met wet linen. She pulled back at once. His hand had come up instinctively to steady her, then stopped in air before touching and lowered again to his thigh, fingers curled once into the fabric. When the house finally rose out of rain and darkness, it did not appear as welcome. It appeared as mass. Stone wings, tall windows mostly black, 2 lamps burning at the main steps, like watchful eyes. Servants ran before the wheels stopped. Orders flew, doors opened. The young lord was carried in. Patricia followed at a half-run through a corridor lined with portraits turned dim in midnight light. In the great hall, beneath antlers and a cold chandelier, a man in steward's black approached with papers already in hand, face pinched with alarm and indignation. "Your Grace, the governess from Lady Vale has arrived under irregular presentation, and I must insist that proper household—" Holden did not raise his voice. "Later. My lord, the nursery staffing and reputational concerns require immediate—" Holden turned his head a fraction. The steward stopped speaking. "Put those papers away, Mr. Crewe. If Miss Petrov leaves this corridor, my son's blood will be on your order. Choose very carefully." Crewe's mouth shut. He bowed and stepped back. Patricia stood under dripping eaves of her own hair and felt the entire geometry of the house redraw around one sentence. Not safety, not yet, but a temporary jurisdiction she had not possessed for years. A maid hurried forward with towels, another with blankets. Patricia took neither until Stephen was settled in a bedchamber warm enough to keep his hands from icing. She checked his pupils in candlelight, reset the compress, and asked for willow bark, vinegar, and clean thread. Holden stood at the foot of the bed motionless, rainwater drying dark on his cuffs. When she finally rose, her knees nearly failed beneath her from cold and strain. He saw it. Of course he saw it. "Sit," he said. "I can stand, Your Grace." "Sit." She sat on the nearest chair because refusal would have been pride masquerading as strength, and she had no strength left to waste. A servant placed a cup of hot broth in her hands. Steam hit her face. Her fingers shook around the porcelain. Holden looked at the blood on her skin, then at the packet ribbon visible where her sleeve had torn. His gaze sharpened. "What did Lady Vale send me?" he asked. "And why was it sent in weather fit to drown a regiment?" Patricia held the cup very still. The waxed packet in her sleeve seemed to pulse with its own heat. "I was told to deliver sealed credentials and await your steward's direction," she said. "That was not my question." She lifted her eyes to his then, large and dark and exhausted, and the answer stopped at her teeth because truth had cost her before and might cost her again, and he was still a duke, still a stranger, still the man whose command had remade this night in one breath. "Open the packet, Your Grace," she said quietly. "Then you will know whether I am what you ordered." Holden held out his hand. "Give it to me." Patricia set the broth aside, reached into her torn sleeve and placed the waxed packet on his palm. The seal carried Lady Vale's falcon above crossed keys. Rain had blurred one edge. The ribbon was still tight. Holden broke it with his thumb and unfolded the papers while standing at the foot of his son's bed, candlelight hard on his face. The first sheet was a formal credential written in a polished hand Patricia had copied often enough to know each false flourish. Miss Patricia Petrov, experienced governess, capable in French and music, discreet, obedient, healthy. The second sheet was shorter. No salutation, no courtesy. Your Grace's steward may place her where useful until obligations are satisfied. She has no independent means and no practical recourse. Her claims regarding inheritance are sentimental and unsupported. Holden read the line twice. His expression did not change. He turned to the third page. It was an account summary, meant to look legal at a glance. Debts listed against Patricia's late father's estate. A transfer value written in the margin. Her name reduced to an asset notation in Lady Vale's own hand. Mr. Crewe, still waiting near the door with rigid posture and lowered eyes, shifted his weight as if to speak. Holden folded the 3 sheets once, precisely, and placed them on the mantel. "What is this?" he asked without looking at Patricia. "If not trafficking through stationery?" Crewe swallowed. "Your Grace, Lady Vale represented the arrangement as a standard placement. The household has been short a qualified nursery governess since June. I accepted terms in good faith." "You accepted a woman in debt payment." Crewe hesitated too long. I accepted staff under sealed reference. Stephen made a rough sound in the bed, a wet catch in his breathing that broke the exchange. Patricia was on her feet at once. She set down the fresh compress, checked the line of his neck, then pressed 2 fingers to his wrist. His pulse jumped and ran too fast. "His skin is heating," she said. "We need cooler cloths now, not cold, cool." And lift him 1/2 an inch at the shoulders. A maid moved, clumsy with fear, and nearly tugged the bandage loose. Patricia caught her hand before the knot slipped. "Like this. Gently. If you pull, he bleeds again." The maid nodded, eyes bright with panic. Patricia guided her grip, then looked toward the hearth. "Boiled water is too hot yet. Add from the ewer. Mrs. Finch, please." The housekeeper, grey-haired and composed even in crisis, gave one sharp nod and obeyed without offence at the instruction. Holden watched that too. A stranger in torn cuffs directing his senior servants, and no one resisting because she was right. Stephen's lashes trembled. He opened his eyes a slit, unfocused, and tried to turn from the light. Patricia covered the nearest candle with her hand to cut the glare. "Stephen," she said softly, "do not move your head. You are safe." His mouth formed a sound that might have been no, might have been mother. The second attempt became a cry cut short by pain. Halden stepped forward, then stopped beside the bed as if striking an unseen boundary. His hands were clenched at his sides. He spoke in the same low command he had used in the yard, though now it carried strain under the iron. "Stephen, look at me!" The boy's eyes moved, failed to fix, and rolled away. Patricia wrung out a cloth and laid it at his throat, then another at his wrists. "He hears you," she said, without looking up. "Do not ask him to answer. Ask him to breathe." Holden's jaw shifted once. He obeyed. "Breathe, Stephen. Slow. Again." For several breaths the room held to that rhythm. Then the boy retched. Patricia turned him with practised speed, kept pressure at the bandage, cleared his mouth and waited until the spasm passed. The maid with the basin began to shake so hard porcelain struck against the bed frame. "Set it down," Patricia told her. "Step back and breathe. You are no use if you faint." The maid set it down and backed away, ashamed and grateful in equal measure. By midnight the rain had eased to a steady tapping at the windows, and the chamber air smelled of vinegar, wet wool, and fear held too long. A rider pounded into the courtyard. Hooves scraped stone. Voices rose in the corridor. Mr. Crewe entered with a narrow man in a travelling cloak stained at the hem, grey hair loose from its queue, a leather case under one arm. The surgeon's accent was French before he spoke a full sentence. "Where is the boy? Move!" He did not bow first. He crossed straight to the bed, snapped open his case, and began a rapid stream of clinical questions. No one in the room but Patricia fully followed. "Perte de connaissance, combien de temps? Vomissement, combien de fois? Pupilles égales. Respiration sifflante ou libre?" Halden's eyes cut to Crewe. Crewe looked blank. Patricia answered without pause. "Unconscious, perhaps 40 minutes on the road, then intermittent response. Vomiting 3 times. Pupils unequal at first, now closer. Breathing obstructed once by poor positioning, now clear unless he turns." The surgeon glanced up sharply at her, measured her soaked dress and ink-stained fingers in one swift sweep, then nodded as one professional to another under pressure. He switched to slower French, then to careful English for the room. "He may live," he said, "if swelling does not increase before morning." He examined the wound. "Who cleaned this?" "I did." "With what?" "Boiled water cooled with clean ewer water." "Pressure only? No spirits?" A quick, approving grunt. He pointed to a small packet in his case and addressed Holden. "Powder in broth, very little. Keep him wakeful each quarter hour if possible. If he sleeps too deeply and cannot be roused, send for me immediately." He turned back to Patricia and resumed in French. "No more pressure there. Here instead. Support the neck, keep him turned if nausea returns." "You have done this before." She thought of stable lofts, attic fevers, nights with no physician and too much blood on borrowed linen. "Yes," the surgeon nodded again. "Then you continue. I return at dawn." He closed his case and left almost as fast as he had arrived. Crewe exhaled, as if released from a vice. "Your Grace, with the surgeon's instructions now clear, Miss Petrov may retire and household staff can resume proper—" Stephen whimpered and clawed weakly at the sheet. Patricia leaned in, caught his wrist before his fingers found the bandage, and spoke close to his ear. "Not that hand. Hold mine." His fingers latched onto hers with surprising force, knuckles pale. Halden answered Crewe without turning. "Miss Petrov does not retire." Crewe's mouth tightened. "Your Grace, there are proprieties. A young unmarried woman in your son's chamber through the night invites talk." "Then let them talk in accurate terms," Halden said. "Tell them she kept him breathing while your proprieties were arranging themselves." Crewe flushed and bowed himself out, stiff as a rod. The chamber settled into the long work that follows panic. Cloths warmed and were changed. The powder was measured. Lamps were trimmed. Once, when Stephen drifted too far, Patricia called his name and pressed her thumb to the centre of his palm until he flinched and came back. Twice he tried to rise in confusion and cried out when pain struck. Each time she steadied him with voice and hand before Halden could cross from command into helpless force. At one point, Mrs. Finch placed a fresh cup of broth on the side table and said quietly, "Miss, you must take this one while it is hot." Patricia shook her head without lifting her gaze from Stephen's face. "Later." Mrs. Finch looked at her for a moment, then at Halden. The Duke gave a single nod. The housekeeper did not argue further. She stood near the hearth instead, warming cloths and passing them wordlessly when needed. An hour dragged by, then another. Stephen's fever climbed despite their care. Sweat dampened his hairline. His breath grew thin and quick, as if each inhale cost negotiation. He began to murmur disconnected fragments, names of horses, a tutor he disliked, the word papa once with a child's softness he would have denied waking. He jerked at shadows only he could see. Patricia laid her palm on his chest, light pressure, steady rhythm. "No riding now," she murmured. "No lessons. Stay here." He fought the delirium with small, exhausted movements and then abruptly began to cry without waking. A silent run of tears from closed eyes that unsettled everyone in the room more than shouting would have done. Halden took one step toward the bed and stopped again, his face gone harder, not softer. The restraint cost him visibly. Patricia did not ask permission. She shifted onto the mattress edge, lifted Stephen's head to rest against her shoulder without disturbing the bandage, and began to hum under her breath. It was not an English nursery tune. The melody rose in minor intervals, simple and old, learned in a language Lady Vale called coarse and unsuited to refined company. Patricia had not sung it aloud since her father died. She had promised herself she would keep that sound private, one piece of him untouched by rooms that mocked what they did not understand. Stephen's breathing hitched once. Then it slowed by a fraction. His fingers loosened around her hand. She kept humming. The words came after the third repetition, barely voiced, consonants softened by fatigue. "Sleep, little falcon, the night has no teeth. The gate is closed, the wolves are beneath. Sleep, little heart, the storm will pass by. Morning will find you, morning will try." Her throat tightened on the last line. She did not stop, At the edge of her vision she saw movement and assumed it was Mrs. Finch returning with cloths. It was Halden. He had crossed to the far side of the room and stood in the shadow between two cabinets where candlelight failed to reach his eyes. He remained there, not interrupting, not speaking, watching. She kept her gaze on Stephen and sang the verse again. Time thinned into small tasks. Replace cloth. Check pulse. Rouse him gently. Speak his name. Watch the pupils. When she finally accepted the broth, it was lukewarm and tasted of salt and onion and life pulled back from the edge by ordinary means. She drank 3 swallows and set it aside. Her hands had begun to tremble from fatigue. She tucked them under the blanket for 1 moment's warmth and withdrew them when Stephen stirred. Sometime deep in the night a junior footman entered with fresh candles and paused, startled by the sight before him. A ragged governess-shaped stranger seated at the young lord's bedside, the Duke standing sentinel in shadow, the housekeeper taking instruction without protest. He recovered, set down the candles and backed out in silence. By morning the house would have a version of that image on every servant's stair. Patricia knew it and did not care. Reputation had never fed her. It had only fenced doors. Toward what must have been 4 o'clock, Stephen woke more fully. His eyes found her face, then slid to the canopy above and back again. "Am I dead?" he whispered. "No," Patricia said. "You are inconveniently alive." For the first time that night, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. The effort of 1. "Head hurts." "I know." He blinked slowly. "Who are you?" "Miss Petrov." He frowned as if searching memory through fog. "The coach." "Yes." He studied her for a moment with a child's unguarded precision. "You are bleeding." She looked down. The cut on her palm had reopened where he had gripped her. Blood marked the sheet in a small crescent. "It is nothing," she said. Stephen's gaze drifted past her shoulder. "Papa, she is bleeding." Holden stepped from the shadow at once. The movement was so quick it startled Mrs. Finch. He came to the bedside, looked first at his son, then at Patricia's hand. His voice was clipped, almost harsh. "Bandage it. It can wait. It has waited." He held out a clean strip of linen from the tray as if issuing a battlefield order. Patricia hesitated, then surrendered her hand because arguing would wake Stephen fully and cost more than compliance. Holden wrapped the palm with competent economy, not secure, pressure exact, not gentle. "Careful!" When he finished, he looked at the bruises still visible above her wrist where the torn cuff had slipped back. "Who did that?" The question landed like dropped iron. Patricia drew her sleeve down over the marks. "Your son needs to rest." Halden's eyes stayed on her face for 1 beat too long, then shifted to Stephen. "Sleep," he told the boy. Stephen obeyed him and slept. Dawn began as a whitening at the edges of the shutters. The rain had stopped. The house, so loud through crisis, quieted into the thin stillness before day staff took over. Patricia sat back in her chair and felt every hour in her bones. Halden had not left the room. Not once. His coat was gone to dry, his shirt sleeves rolled, dark hair fallen forward again as though he had forgotten to care. He stood now by the window, hands braced on the sill, looking out at a courtyard washed clean. Mrs. Finch came to Patricia with a folded blanket. "Miss, you must close your eyes for 10 minutes. I will wake you at once if he stirs." Patricia shook her head. "You will collapse by breakfast," Mrs. Finch said, not unkindly. "Then I will collapse in a chair where I can still hear him." Mrs. Finch's expression changed very slightly. Respect, reluctant and real. She set the blanket around Patricia's shoulders anyway, and returned to the hearth. A knock sounded. The French surgeon entered, coat damp from the road, and examined Stephen in growing light. He checked pupils, pulse, breathing. He asked 3 questions in French. Patricia answered all 3. He gave one final look at the bandage placement and nodded. To this point, very good, he said. If fever breaks by evening, danger lessens. He closed his case and faced Halden. Your son lives because intervention was immediate and intelligent. Remember that when people begin telling a cleaner story. Halden inclined his head once. I do not require cleaner stories. The surgeon departed. The door shut. Silence held for several seconds. Patricia looked at Stephen, at the slow rise and fall of his chest, and only then permitted herself one long exhale she had denied all night. Her shoulders dropped. The room swayed once from fatigue and steadied. Halden turned from the window. Miss Petroff! She stood because he was a duke and because she had not forgotten where she stood, no matter what hours had passed. Yes, Your Grace. He crossed to the mantel, took up the folded papers from Lady Vale and held them between 2 fingers, as if they were contaminated. You were sent here as settlement. Yes. You knew. I suspected. And you still chose to keep my son alive before clearing your own name. She met his gaze. Her eyes were shadowed dark with sleeplessness. A name can wait an hour. A child cannot. Something in his face shifted then, so slight another observer might have missed it. Not warmth, recognition with weight. He set the papers down again, not on the mantel this time, but in her notebook that lay beside the chair where she had dropped it during the night. He aligned the edges carefully. You will eat, he said. You will sleep 2 hours in the room adjacent to this chamber. Then you will return and brief me on every instruction the surgeon gave, in French and English both. Patricia opened her mouth to object out of reflex, out of habit, out of years spent being told she had no right to fatigue. Halden cut across it with quiet finality. That was not a request. Patricia closed her mouth on the refusal and felt it burn her throat on the way down. Yes, Your Grace. The words tasted of obedience she had long despised. They also tasted, to her own surprise, of relief. Her knees were unsteady. Her hands no longer trusted themselves. The blanket on her shoulders had slipped half to the floor. She bent to catch it and nearly swayed. Halden moved before she finished the motion. One hand came out, not touching, close enough to stop a fall if needed. He drew it back at once, as if even that near contact required discipline. Mrs. Finch, he said, still watching Patricia, take Miss Petroff to the blue antechamber. Lock the corridor door from the gallery side. She is not to be disturbed. Mrs. Finch blinked once. Your Grace, from the gallery side? From the gallery side. The distinction landed with weight. It did not confine Patricia. It blocked everyone else. Patricia looked up sharply. That is unnecessary. I require only a chair near the hearth. Halden turned his head toward her. Dawn light caught the scar at his cheek and made it look whiter than skin. You require sleep. You require food that is not broth gone cold. You require dry clothing. You will have all 3 before anyone asks you another question. It is your son who... My son is breathing, he said, because you have not sat down in 12 hours. That debt is mine now. I choose how it is paid. The room went very still after that. Mrs. Finch lowered her gaze. Even the maid at the washstand stopped wringing cloth. Patricia had lived years where care arrived wrapped in performance or bargain. This was neither. This was command sharpened into shelter given in front of witnesses who would repeat it. She did not know where to place it in the order of things she understood. She tried one last protest, quieter. Your steward will object. Mr. Crewe will obey. He believes I am a scandal in torn sleeves. Halden's mouth shifted by a fraction. Not softness, not amusement, a hard acknowledgement. He may keep his beliefs, he will keep the pian silent. By full dawn, pale light had reached the lower panes and turned the room from candle gold to winter grey. Stephen stirred. Patricia moved at once, habit stronger than instruction, and Holden lifted a hand without looking away from his son. Stop! One word, flat, final. She froze beside the bed, pulse striking hard at her wrist. Holden adjusted the blanket at Stephen's shoulder with unexpected precision, checked the bandage with the back of his fingers, then stepped aside exactly enough for Patricia to see the boy's face. "Now," he said, "tell me if that placement is wrong." She looked. The support was right. The pressure was right. He had watched every motion through the night, taken each one into memory, and repeated it cleanly. "It is correct," she said. "I know." He said it without arrogance, only fact. Mrs. Finch came to Patricia's elbow. "Miss!" Patricia did not move. Her eyes were fixed on Stephen's breathing, slow but even. Holden noticed. Of course he noticed. "She will call if his colour changes," he said. "I will call if his colour changes. You are 10 steps away, not 10 miles. Patricia let Mrs. Finch guide her toward the adjoining door. At the threshold she stopped and turned back, despite herself. Holden had resumed his place by the bed, not seated, not resting. Standing with one hand on the carved post, body angled toward his son, and toward the door she had just crossed, as if he meant to guard both directions at once. She had seen men display concern for an audience. This had no audience now, but servants who knew better than to speak. Yet he remained like a sentry carved from dark stone. The blue antechamber smelled of beeswax and cedar. A small fire had already been laid and lit. Someone had placed a basin of warm water on a stand, a stack of dry linens, a plain wool dress that had been altered quickly at the sides, and a tray with bread, cheese, and tea strong enough to wake the dead. Nothing ornate, nothing performative, useful things, chosen by a mind that respected utility. Patricia stood in the centre of the room and stared at the tray as if it were written in a language she had not studied. Mrs. Finch closed the door gently. The click of the latch sounded louder than it should. "You may sit now," the housekeeper said. Patricia did not sit. He ordered the gallery door locked. He did. Against whom? Mrs. Finch gave her a level look. Against interruption. Patricia held that gaze for a second, then another. From Lady Vale? From anyone who believes rank permits entry. The answer settled into Patricia's chest with a strange ache. Protection had always been conditional in her world. Here it had been declared as procedure. She moved to the basin. Warm water turned pink, then red, as she washed dried blood from her hands and wrists. Bruises showed clearer in daylight, finger marks gone yellow at the edges, old and undeniable. She scrubbed harder than needed, as if friction might erase evidence and memory together. It did neither. Mrs. Finch caught her wrist before skin broke. "Enough!" Patricia stilled. The older woman reached for a cloth and dabbed at a streak of blood near Patricia's temple. "Eat first, then sleep. You may be stubborn after." "I'm not stubborn." Mrs. Finch's mouth made the smallest motion. "Then you are very determined for a person about to collapse." Patricia sank into the chair by the fire because her legs chose for her. Heat licked through wet stockings and made pain bloom where numbness had been. She tore bread with bandaged fingers and forced down 2 bites. Salt from the cheese stung a split at her lip she had not felt until now. From the other side of the wall came no voices, only an occasional floorboard complaint, and once the low murmur of Holden speaking Stephen's name. She drank tea. Her hands trembled less. Mrs. Finch unfolded the plain dress. "This was my daughter's before she married. It should fit with pins." Patricia looked at the fabric, sturdy and dark, and then at her own gown, stiff with rain and blood and road mud. "I cannot accept personal charity. It is not charity. It is laundry management with urgency." That might have been the closest thing to humour the house had allowed all night. It passed quickly and did not return. Patricia changed behind a screen while Mrs. Finch turned down the narrow bed. Dry wool against her skin felt almost painful after hours of cold. She sat on the bed's edge and unpinned her hair with clumsy fingers. Dark strands fell damp over her shoulders. She braided them once, loosely, and lay down without meaning to sleep yet. Mrs. Finch drew the blanket up and paused. "Miss Petroff." Patricia opened heavy eyes. "His Grace has not left the threshold since you crossed it." Patricia frowned. "Threshold of which room?" "Both, in a manner. He stands where he can hear his son breathe and hear whether you wake calling. He has refused chair and tray. He has refused even to remove his boots." Patricia stared at the ceiling, at a water stain shaped like a bent wing. "Why tell me that?" "Because houses are built of facts, not rumours," Mrs. Finch said. "Rest on facts." She left. The door closed. Patricia listened. At first she heard only the fire settling and her own pulse in her ear. Then, faint through wood and plaster, the measured sound of a man shifting weight from one leg to the other, and then going still again, not pacing, holding position. She closed her eyes and opened them at once. Sleep was dangerous in houses where one was disposable. Sleep meant missing the order that changed one's fate. Sleep meant waking to locks moved, trunks gone, papers burned. She knew that lesson in her bones. A knock came, 2 firm taps. Not Mrs. Finch. The sound carried authority even through restraint. "Miss Petroff." Holden. Through the door, not entering. She pushed herself up, blanket pooling at her waist. "Yes, Your Grace." "Are you in bed?" The question was so abrupt it almost offended. "Yes." "Good, you will remain there 2 hours." "You cannot enforce sleep by decree." A pause, then lower. "I can enforce quiet." Against her will, a thread of warmth moved through the exhaustion. He continued, voice clipped again. "I have sent for your trunk from the posting yard records. It was left at the south entry under guard. No one has opened it." Her breath caught. The trunk held little of value to anyone else. To her it held everything that could still be called hers. "Thank you," she said, and hated how thin her voice sounded. Another pause. "The notebook remains in my son's chamber," he said. "Where I put it, I have not read it." Patricia turned her face toward the closed door, as if she might see through oak. "You noticed it. I notice what keeps people alive. Not kindness, not apology. Precision." Yet the line struck deeper than comfort would have. She said, "If you had read it, you might have understood why Lady Vale sent me." "I understood the moment I read her second page." Silence lengthened. She thought he had gone. Then his voice came again, altered by something she could not name. "You told me to ask him to breathe and not answer. You were correct. I would have done damage in my haste." Patricia held very still. A duke admitting error to a woman he had met in a bloody scullery was not small currency. It was a coin once spent that could not be recalled. "He is your son," she said carefully. "Haste is permitted. Not when it costs him." The floorboard near the door gave a quiet complaint as he shifted, then stilled once more. She could not stop herself. "You have not slept either." "That is irrelevant." "It is relevant if you are to keep him through fever." No answer. "Your Grace." Nothing for 3 breaths. Then, "Sleep, Miss Petroff." The words should have sounded like dismissal. They did not. They sounded like a man standing guard outside a locked corridor in a half-lit house, choosing stillness because motion would mean distance he would not permit. Her eyes burned. She shut them hard and turned her face into the pillow so he would not hear anything in her breathing that might be mistaken for weakness. Minutes passed, or an hour. She did not know. She drifted near sleep and surfaced again when voices rose faintly in the farther corridor. Mr. Crewe, tight with controlled outrage. "Your Grace, the breakfast room expects—" Holden, low and lethal. "The breakfast room may starve for one morning." "Lady Gresham and the rector's wife are in residence. Questions will be asked." "Then answer them." "With what statement, my lord?" A brief silence. Patricia could hear it like held steel. "With this one," Holden said. "Miss Petrov is under my protection. Any person who speaks of her as staff purchased in settlement will leave this house before noon. Any person who questions her presence in my son's chamber questions my judgment in my own halls. You will carry that message precisely." Crewe made a strangled sound that might have been assent. Holden added, each word distinct, "And Mr. Crewe, send a rider to the magistrate in Harborough, quietly. I want an inventory witness at Holden House by tomorrow." Patricia's eyes opened fully in the dim room. Inventory witness, not rumour, procedure, record, the language of contracts, not emotions. It was the language she trusted. Crewe retreated. Footsteps faded. Holden did not. The floorboard near her door sounded once, then settled. She pictured him there in shirt-sleeves gone cold, jaw set, watching two thresholds as if both contained lives he would not hand over to chance or gossip or custom. She turned onto her side, bandaged palm against the blanket, and let sleep take her at last, because for the first time in years she believed that if she closed her eyes, she would wake to the same door still guarded. She woke to a knock and the smell of fresh coal, and for one disorienting second she thought she was still in the attic at Vale House and late for someone else's command. "Miss Petrov." Mrs. Finch opened the door a hand's width. 2 hours, as ordered. The boy asked for water and kept it down. Patricia sat up, too fast. The room tilted, then steadied. Her bandaged palm throbbed. She swung her feet to the floor and reached for the dark wool dress laid across the chair. It was still strange to dress in cloth, not already worn to threads. When she entered Stephen's chamber, Holden was where she had last heard him, near the threshold between rooms, boots still on, sleeves still rolled. His eyes went first to her face, then to the cup in Stephen's hand, then to the window where morning had turned from pearl to a hard October grey. "You slept," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "Good. Brief me." She did. In French first, then in English, precise and without ornament. Powder dose, signs of pressure rise, intervals for waking, fluid in spoons, not cups, quiet light, no sudden movement. Holden listened without interrupting. Mr. Crewe stood near the door with a ledger and a tight mouth, writing each instruction as if transcription might atone for delay. By noon, the surgeon returned, examined Stephen, and gave the room its first measurable mercy. "Fever has broken by 1 degree. Danger is not gone, but it is retreating." He packed his instruments, nodded once to Patricia, and added, "You may stop looking as if death is at the footboard. For this hour, it is not." The reprieve lasted less than 10 minutes. Wheels ground in the courtyard. A carriage door snapped. Silk rustled in the corridor before the maid reached the chamber door to announce what everyone already knew, by scent alone. Lady Vale entered in silver-grey satin, hat veiled, gloves pearl-buttoned, Arabella and Cressida behind her like polished echoes. 2 guests from breakfast trailed at a careful distance, drawn by alarm and rank. Lady Vale did not curtsy. She let her gaze travel over Patricia's borrowed dress, the bandage on her hand, the chair by Stephen's bed. "There you are," she said, as if addressing a truant maid. "Collect your things. You have caused enough spectacle." Patricia stood, pulse striking hard but steady. She moved one step closer to Stephen's bed before she answered. "I'm attending an injured child." "You are attending theft." Lady Vale's voice sharpened for the witnesses. "You stole private account books and family papers, then slandered your guardian to secure favour in this house." Cressida gave a soft laugh into her glove. Arabella looked past Patricia toward Holden with practised distress. Holden spoke without raising his voice. "Stop!" The single word landed harder than a shout. Lady Vale turned toward him with widened eyes and courtly disbelief. "Your Grace, this is a family matter." "No," Holden said, "it is fraud." He looked to the corridor. "Mr. Dawes." The magistrate entered with a clerk and 2 constables in plain dark coats. Patricia recognised neither face, but she recognised procedure, ink case, witness book, folded writ, the deliberate calm of men who prefer paper to force. Lady Vale's colour altered by a fraction. "What is this insult?" Dawes inclined his head. "Madame, a report was lodged this morning regarding forged debt instruments, unlawful conversion of property, and assault upon Miss Patricia Petrov. I am here to take statements and secure evidence." Lady Vale laughed, brittle and bright. "Evidence from a hysterical dependent with delusions of entitlement?" Patricia did not answer that. She turned to Mrs. Finch instead. "My trunk, please. The one from the south entry." Halden had already given the order with a glance. A footman brought the trunk and set it on a cleared table. Mud from the posting yard still marked one corner. The brass tag still read Vale in crooked black letters. Patricia touched it once, then lifted her chin toward Dawes. "I request this be opened before witnesses." "Granted," the magistrate said. The lock stuck on first turn, then yielded. Inside lay 2 dresses, a wrapped grammar, her father's worn Latin text, a packet of rent receipts, and beneath them a leather folio tied with plain cord. Patricia lifted the folio with both hands and set it beside her stitched notebook, which Holden retrieved from the mantel and placed next to it in full view. She opened the notebook first. Dense lines in her narrow hand, dates, figures, terms, side-by-side copies of ledgers before and after alteration. She turned pages until she found the entry she had marked with thread. "Here," she said to Dawes. "Original sum recorded in March. Here the altered sum presented in July. Same debt listed twice under variant headings. And here," she tapped with her bandaged finger, "signature pressure inconsistent with my father's hand. He lifted on final stroke. This one drives downward." Dawes bent over the page. His clerk copied references rapidly. Patricia untied the leather folio. Inside, protected by oiled paper, was the document her father had sealed 3 days before his death. A certified abstract of estate holdings, signed by 2 witnesses, now dismissed, with a notation appointing temporary oversight of Patricia's inheritance to be reviewed by court if his widow remarried or liquidated principal assets within 1 year. Attached was his personal memorandum naming disputed debts as unverified until matched to primary contracts. Lady Vale's composure cracked. "That paper is private." "It is mine," Patricia said. "He wrote it for my protection." Lady Vale stepped forward as if to snatch it. Holden moved once, and she stopped without his hand touching her. He did not look at her. He looked at the constables. "No one touches those pages except the magistrate." Dawes examined seals, witness marks, and paper stock. He compared signatures with the packet Holden had received the previous night, and with 2 letters from the folio. The differences were not subtle once named, downstrokes too heavy, dates overwritten, amount columns crowded where original spacing had been generous. Mr. Crewe cleared his throat, still staring at the documents. "Your Grace, I must make a statement." He looked at last at Patricia. "I received Lady Vale's references and believed them sufficient because I chose convenience over scrutiny. Miss Petrov told me this morning the papers might not withstand comparison. She was correct. I did not ask sooner. That failure is mine." He stopped there. Whatever else he had meant to say in earlier silences, he never said. Dawes straightened. "Lady Vale, you will accompany my officers pending formal charge." Arabella gasped. Cressida whispered, "This is monstrous." Lady Vale drew herself up, silk whispering like a threat. "You cannot arrest me on the testimony of a girl." Dawes held up the folio. "I can detain you on documents, witness statements, and physical marks consistent with assault. You may contest all of it before proper court." Lady Vale's gaze snapped to Halden. "By what right do you interfere?" Halden let the quiet gather until even the fire seemed to withdraw. "By the right of her legal guardian recognised this morning under emergency petition and Mr. Dawes's seal pending chancery review." He set a fresh document on the table, wax still dark. "By the right of the man who has restored her estate accounts from funds held in trust until judgment, and by the right of the man who asks for her hand where all may witness." No one in the room moved. Patricia felt the words strike in 3 separate waves. Guardian, estate restored, asks, not takes, asks. She looked at him fully. "Your Grace, I will not trade one keeper for another." "You will not," he said. "I keep title to my property." "Yes. I establish a school at Halden Village for tenant girls. Literacy, sums, contract reading." "Yes." "I choose the household accounts I oversee and those I refuse." A pause, brief and absolute. "Yes," she swallowed. "And Stephen's lessons in French begin again when the surgeon permits." At that, Stephen, pale against pillows but awake enough to listen, whispered, "Cruel." Patricia turned, and for the first time in this house she allowed the smallest curve at her mouth. "You survived. You may now decline verbs." Halden's mouth shifted once. Not quite a smile. "State your answer, Miss Petrov," Dawes said quietly, pen ready. Patricia faced Halden again. "On those terms, I accept." Lady Vale made a sound between disbelief and fury as the constables took position at her sides. She tried one final glance of command at Patricia, the old look that had once been enough to force silence. It reached no purchase now. The officers escorted her from the chamber. Arabella and Cressida followed in shocked rustles, their loaded glances emptied into nothing. 3 days passed before Dawes returned with preliminary orders. Lady Vale remanded on fraud and assault counts, contested debts frozen, sale of the Petrov library flagged for reversal where possible, and Patricia's inheritance reinstated subject to final court ratification. The notebook and folio were logged, copied and sealed. 1 certified copy was placed in Halden's safe, 1 in Dawes's records, and 1 in Patricia's own locked desk. In January, under a hard white sky and chapel glass filmed with frost, Patricia walked the aisle in winter wool trimmed with her mother's recovered pearls. Halden stood, waiting, in dark, formal coat, shoulders square, face unreadable except at the eyes. Stephen, thinner but fully mended, held the ring cushion with solemn injury to his dignity. When Patricia's hand trembled as the vows were spoken, Halden bent his head just enough for only her to hear. "Stay." She met his gaze, steady now. "I choose to." The chapel doors opened to cold light, and this time when she stepped forward, no one in the room mistook her for freight.